You know, everybody likes to do all the fancy stuff when it comes to training, but there are some progressive resistance type techniques from the old school bodybuilding genre that worked really well and continue to do so. Because you got to think, I mean, our bodies, genetically speaking, haven't changed a whole lot in the last, I'll just say 100,000 years, just to be arbitrary. And so, you know, we do have different and more advanced methods of training, no doubt. But when it comes to the tried and true basics to get a person started on the journey toward bodybuilding, bigger, stronger, faster, which I'm a big proponent of, one of the first things that you should learn before you do anything else is the idea of progressive resistance. Okay, so I'll be honest with you. I'm not some big-time molecular blah, blah, blah. I'm just a regular old guy who's pretty smart about training and building muscle. Definitely a proponent of the bigger, faster, stronger system. And so therefore, one of the things that I've noticed in training myself and training others is there is a particular method to the madness of how you train, especially if you want to progress long term, and especially if you want to remain somewhat injury free, because 90% of the injuries that I've run into have more to do with over exuberance and ego lifting than they do with actual methodical progressive principles. So, you ready to dive into it? Let's hit it. Okay, first thing I'm going to talk about when it comes to training is something that I feel like everybody needs to understand, because I've noticed, you know, in the past few years we've gotten into this, we push around words like instinctive training and constant variation and those type of things and muscle confusion. But, you know, from a bro science perspective, from an old school Gen Xer who got pretty big and strong in his day, let me tell you what I think that means and what I've noticed. Am I going to say you don't ever have to change your routines? No. You do have to change them sometimes. There are those rare ones of us, genetically speaking, who can use the same routine for 10 years and continue to make progress on it and have very few sticking points and plateaus. And that's cool and all, but that's not really how everything works for most of us. But do I think you should be varying your routines like every month? Hell no. And I'm going to tell you why. And there's a scientific basis for what I'm telling you, but like I say, I'm more bro science when it comes to explaining stuff. That's why people like to ask me about training, because I'm able to kind of put it in a way that's layman's terms, as they will say, or, you know, anybody can understand. So here's what I'm going to tell you about progression, and I'm going to tell you about variant workouts. This is what I found, and this is what I found with people I've even trained. So here we go. When you're training to improve yourself, especially bigger, faster, stronger model, there is kind of a method to how all of those things work in terms of the progression and even with things like muscle confusion. So when you first train your muscles on a routine, let's say you get a trainer or you've gotten some knowledge of your own and you set yourself up a bodybuilding routine, you know, or weightlifting, whatever you want to call it. But bodybuilding, in this case, is the word I'm going to use most often. There are three things that happen before you should actually vary your routine. When you first start out that new routine, and this seems to be true even if these are exercises you've done before, the order and sequence in which you arrange the exercises is going to be different each time you set up a new routine. And so you need to really go through these three phases before you actually even consider varying a routine. Because a lot of times if you don't go through these three phases in the process of your routine, then you can't really say for sure that it's not working, because there is a time element to it. So step one when you're training is what I call innervation. That's probably the wrong word. Don't really care. I'm going to explain the concept. when you first start a new routine, let's say you have 5 exercises. Let's say we'll do chest. So let's say you're doing flies of some kind, bench press, dips. Maybe you're finishing it off with a push-up and maybe something on an incline. Okay, so once you start that routine, you're going to have your nervous system need to learn to fire all over again, because it not only needs to learn to fire for the particular exercise that you're doing, and especially if you go from gym to gym to gym and you don't stay at the same gym and use the same equipment all the time, your muscles are going to need to interact with your nervous system to coordinate, for lack of a better word, learn how to do those exercises properly again, or to do them properly on various machines, because different gyms, different dumbbells, different machines, the weight distributions are not going to be exact. It's going to vary. How you sit on a certain bench is going to vary. All of that stuff is step 1. So I would say your first 30 days need to be about the innervation phase and then the progressive resistance phase. So innervation, step 1. You got to get used to it again, even if they've done them before. You haven't necessarily done them in that order and sequence, or in that rep and set combination, or with that particular weight. So that's step 1. Okay, so step 2 is the muscular adaptation phase. So after you've gotten used to performing those exercises in that certain order and sequence in those certain places, your nervous system will, coordinate. Then that's when the progressive resistance part of the equation comes into play, because you're going to be progressively increasing the load. And that's going to cause your muscles to start to request that they adapt. So let's say you can we'll use push-ups because it's easy. You can do 100 push-ups. And you can do that, and by the time you get to 100, you're freaking dying. I mean, you feel like you've gotten shot with a cannon. You're dripping sweat. All of that stuff is, part of the deal. So week 2, you'll still maybe get shot with a cannon, but you may not be as winded. Week 3, you may be even less so. By week 4, you're able to at least complete it all without having to stop or without feeling like you can't do anything else. Okay, so at this point, where you're able to complete it all without having to hold your heart, or somebody has to carry you out in a body bag, that's where your muscles are beginning to request that they adapt. In other words, they're getting stronger and more capable of handling that load because it's become a regular part of their existence. That's when you do things like you add resistance and or repetitions, like you're adding more weight to the bar or the exercise, or you're increasing the number of repetitions, or if you want to be even more extreme, you can increase the number of sets, or all 3 of those things in their proper order. And we'll talk about that later. And so that is the second step. That is the second month. So let me be clear. The first month should be spent getting to know the ins and outs of your routine, developing better, proper form, learning to do the exercises properly so you tax your muscles to the point where they begin to adapt. Then you have to get more weight resistance, more reps or more sets to increase the load and continue to feel that stress. And that's when the muscles start to ask for adaptations, because you are continuing to tax them. So in their minds, quote unquote, they're like, okay, this joker is not letting up. He's going to keep doing this. So we need to get stronger in order to handle it. And then that's when we move to step 3. Okay, so step 3, I'm going to talk about in relation to bodybuilding, and that's the hypertrophy. This could also be just simply the increases in strength and ability that come along with the training process. But in this case, we're going to talk about getting bigger. So now your muscles have learned to do the exercises coordinated. They've begun to adapt because you're putting more weight and stress on them somehow to make them need to request to get bigger and stronger. And this is where you actually get the true development and the most out of your routine, is when the muscles begin to get so much stronger and increase in size. And that size is manipulatable because it depends on what you eat and how you recover and rest and things of that nature. But the point is, that third section is where the muscle begins to make the changes a little more permanent. Of course, nothing is completely permanent, because if you do nothing, eventually you'll lose your strength and size. But you can maintain a level much easier once you get to this phase without as much effort as it took to build it in the first place. So this is the third phase. So this is where you actually become bigger, faster, stronger. This is the only time that I would be considering changing the routine, because once you've gotten to this phase, you've gotten the majority of what you need to get out of the routine. So now it would be okay to change it. Now, me personally, if I'm still getting results from a routine, I will keep it until I reach a sticking point. That's sort of ride it till you break it type of mentality. So if it's still working for me 4 months later, 5 months later, 6 months later, I'll continue to use it, and I'll just continue the progression. I don't have to start over. I just have to continue the progression, and then my body will continue to ask me to adapt. But if you get to a point where you feel like that's not working for you, or just from mental boredom you want to change it, because that is a long time for a lot of people these days to hold on to a routine, then you make some adjustments. You change your exercises, you change your order, you change where you go, you do it different, you pick different complete training, maybe you cross train. But this is where you actually bring in the muscle confusion part of the principle, is after at least the 3 months. I would even say 4, but at least the 3 months is the point at which you should change the routine if you need to, or because you're bored, then change it. But before that, no, because your body has to go through those 3 stages, and eventually I'll turn them into something professional. But those 3 stages, in order to get the most out of whatever routine you're planning. Okay, let's add some notes. So let's go all the way back and talk about progressive resistance as it applies to this. Now, there was an old school principle called a pyramid system. A lot of people kind of dismissed it because it is a very old tactic. Person who made it most famous for me and people in my generation was a guy named Joe Weider. He still has some things around today, and there's still principles that he claimed as his own that actually are helpful and work, but we're going to just talk about progressive resistance. So let's start with weightlifting. So we're going to take and develop a routine, and then we're going to pick out our weights for that. Now, what I always suggested when selecting weights for bodybuilding in particular is that your initial weight that you start with should be something that, as far as your working sets, and I'll explain that in a minute, go, you should be somewhere between 8 to 12 or possibly even 15 repetitions. So you're picking a weight that you can do for 8 to start with, just so you have some room to wiggle. Being 8 as the last rep that you can do comfortably without a decent amount of pain. Don't hurt yourself. I'm not a believer in that kind of stuff, but you definitely need to be working pretty hard to complete that last rep, whatever the number is. And so that's how you're going to select your weight. So that's where we're going to start. Okay, so now with the progression, if you're using the pyramid principle, you're usually going to do 1 or 2 warm-up sets, and they're not necessarily counted against your total. So let's say you decide you're going to do 3 sets of bench press, because it's easy. So your first set should be a lighter weight than what your quote unquote work sets are going to be. So let's say your work set's going to be 185. So you might start with 135, and instead of doing your 8 to 12 repetitions there, you're going to try to aim for a higher number, say like 12 to 15. And, take the time to go through those and do them with proper form. And that kind of gives the muscle time to adjust to the fact that it's going to be bearing some load and some weight, and warming up the muscle so that everything flows a lot smoother. Getting old, you definitely need to warm up, but it's not just for old people. Warming up helps to loosen the muscles up. Okay, so we've loosened the muscles up, and we're getting ready to put in some work. So now we've done our warm-up set, or possibly two. Especially if your gym is kind of cold, you might consider doing 2 warm-up sets. You're not pushing these to failure. You're just kind of, like I say, warming the muscle up, getting it ready. But once you've done that, now we move on to the actual progression part. So now you're going to get your, let's say you've picked out, in this example, 185. You start. So now you're going to do the 185 for your 8 to 12. And so you can do this pyramid type thing 2 different ways on this. You can pyramid up to 12 by doing 8 on the first set, 10 on the second set, 12 on the third set. My honest opinion about that is, if you're able to do that, then you picked the wrong weight. Okay? So when you're doing these first ones, especially when you're first beginning your routine, that 8 should be the 8 should be the upper limit of what you can do. Okay? Now, here's where the progression part comes in. So you're going to stay with this weight through all your sets, and that's just called straight sets. And you're going to do that until you can easily complete 12 reps after the warm-up with each set of those 3 working sets. When you're able to do that is where the other part of progression comes in, which is adding weight. I'm also not a big believer in adding huge amounts of weight to the bar to take you all the way back down to 8. I think you should add a small amount, like between 2 to 5 pounds on each side of the bar, and continue working that rep range of 8 to 12 until you are up on the upper limit of that 12 again. And you're going to do that every time. And the goal is to be able to progress like that at least every 1 to 2 weeks. If you think about it, if you're able to add 5 pounds every week to an exercise for 52 weeks, you have increased your ability to handle 104 pounds more than you did the previous year. If you think adding 100-pound total to an exercise isn't going to change your body, you're out of your freaking mind. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, so let's say you want to consider keeping going with the progression portion, and you've made the necessary weight adjustments every week. The next thing you can do once you get to an upper limit, especially if you're going to hold on to a routine for a long period of time, is then you can add additional sets to the mix. Once you've progressed, especially if you're still making gains with the same routine after 6 months, even a year, it's time to add some sets. Even if you change your routine, it's probably time to add a set or 2, simply because your ability to handle that workload is increased because you've become bigger, faster, and stronger over that year of consistent training. So we'll talk about that part next. So if you get to the point in the progressive resistance principle where you decide to add a set, this is where the pyramid thing really comes into play. Because what you'll do at this point is you will add repetitions to each of those sets. So let's say you move up from 3 sets after your warm-up to 4 sets. So what you're going to do at this point is you're going to pick a weight that you can handle for the 12 easy, and you're going to do 8 with that weight. Then you're going to add weight to your second set, and then you're going to again shoot for the 8 to 12. And then you're going to add weight on your third set and do the same, and your fourth set and do the same. So you see how we've increased the speed at which you're going to progress here, because you're no longer just doing straight sets and adding 5 or 10 pounds to your workouts each week. You're actually going to be adding weight on each set, and that's going to be more cumulative over time. I'm not going to do the big math on it, but let's just say you're adding 5 pounds each set, and you're doing that every week, because your starting number is going to get a little bigger each week as you get stronger. Then instead of, say, making a 104-pound gain in an exercise in a year, you may make a 200-pound gain in a year. Now, that's not usually normal, and a lot of times the only people who do that are, well, let's just say chemically enhanced, and there's no judgment here. But there's a certain point at which your body is incapable of doing extra work without some kind of recovery agent. That's where we get into things like supplements, and then even the anabolic or chemical decision is what we used to call it. So anyway, so that's what you're going to do with progressive resistance. You're going to start with the time it takes to adapt to the exercises. Then you add the progressive weights. Then you add the progressive set. Then you start to pyramid up within those sets. You'll find by this time your strength and your ability to handle new situations and new exercises will improve dramatically. But this core principle is something you can keep pretty much for the whole of your weightlifting life, even though you're changing your exercises and your sets and things of that nature. This basic principle is at the core of just about everything that they're now teaching you about muscle confusion and things of that nature. It's always based on some type of progression. So that's the lesson for today, and we'll talk about some other training principles at a different time. But in the meantime, I thank you for sharing my armchair, and I hope you have a great day whenever and wherever you are.